It was a quiet night, with the clock approaching midnight. Most of the patrons had already left the bar, and the space was dimly lit with only the faint glow of the corner lamps. I was there, as usual, ready to close up. I was cleaning the last few glasses, already thinking about the bed waiting for me at home. The night had been uneventful. Until then, at least, it seemed so. At that moment, the bar's door slowly creaked open, the sound echoing loudly in the stillness of the early hours. I looked toward the entrance, expecting to see a late customer, but what I saw was something different. A man entered, walking with slow, deliberate steps. He wore a long coat, and his face was partially hidden beneath a hat. He looked out of place, as though he'd stepped out of a completely different time. "Is the bar still open?" he asked, his voice raspy and cold, each word seeming to escape slowly from his mouth. His tone was so low that I had to lean in to hear him. I nodded, unsure of what to think. After all, it was my job to serve any customer who came in. He approached the bar and sat on the farthest stool, near the corner. The room was already cold, but as he settled, a chilling sensation spread through the air around him. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the bar, until finally, he looked up and said, "I'd like a special drink, absinthe." I was surprised. It was a drink we rarely served, but luckily we had a bottle stashed away. I turned to retrieve the drink, but I noticed that his unusual presence still left me feeling uneasy. As I prepared his glass, he began watching me intently, his gaze penetrating. It felt like he was analyzing my every move, which made me uneasy in a way I couldn't ignore. I asked him if everything was all right, but he merely nodded and, without a word, gave me a faint smile. As I placed the glass in front of him, he muttered, almost as if talking to himself, "It's interesting to see how time passes, yet things remain the same." Intrigued, I asked what he meant by that, but he averted his gaze, maintaining an air of mystery. "Have you worked here long?" he asked after a prolonged silence. I told him yes, a few years. He then nodded and said, as if he knew the place well, "This bar has seen a lot, many sad stories." Curious about the conversation, I asked if he was an old regular. After all, he seemed to know quite a bit about the place. He laughed, but it was a cold, joyless laugh. "You could say that," he replied without giving away much. Hours passed, and he remained there, slowly sipping his absinthe. I noticed he avoided talking about himself, but his questions grew more personal, as if he were trying to unravel me. He wanted to know about my life, my fears, and even mentioned things that only people close to me would know. Then he mentioned something strange. "You know, I heard about a waitress who used to work here," he said in a somber tone. "She disappeared mysteriously, didn't she? That caught me off guard. I'd heard rumors, an old story told by the veteran staff about a woman who had worked there and one day simply vanished without a trace." "Yes, I've heard a few stories," I responded cautiously. He continued smiling, but there was something unsettling about that smile. He seemed to be enjoying the topic. "Some people say she's still around," he murmured, glancing around as if searching for something. At this point, I started to feel uncomfortable. The conversation was crossing the line of what I considered normal. I decided I needed to find out who this man was. I asked his name, but he ignored the question and began telling the story instead. "I was here many years ago," he began, as if recalling a distant memory. "Back then, the bar was different, with a more rustic decor. There was a large mirror behind the bar, and I remember everyone talking about it." I knew exactly which mirror he was referring to. It was still there, but it seemed impossible for him to speak so familiarly about something from so long ago. With each sentence he spoke, the atmosphere grew darker, as if the bar itself were responding to his presence. I began noticing a faint mist forming around the man, blurring his image slightly. That was when he made a revelation that left me speechless. "That waitress who disappeared," he said with a cold smile, "she was my wife." Shock overtook me. That explained his interest, but it also made the situation much more eerie. I wanted to ask more, but he interrupted me. "She disappeared, but I feel she never left," he said with a distant look as if lost in his thoughts. "It's as if she's still here, trapped somehow, waiting." The discomfort grew. What did he mean by trapped? I looked around the bar, feeling a slight breeze pass by, even with all the windows closed. The man noticed my look and gave a low chuckle. Don't you feel her here sometimes? A presence, silent but constant? Before I could respond, he spoke in a way that seemed like a warning. This bar holds secrets, he said. Some are best left forgotten. He stared at me, waiting for my reaction, and I felt as if I were trapped in a snare. I tried to hide my nerves, but it was impossible. This man knew much more than I had imagined, and his presence filled me with panic. I decided it was time to close up. I'm sorry, but we're closing, I announced, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, finished his drink, and rose slowly. Before leaving, he looked at me and said, "Remember, she never left, and neither have I." When he left, I felt a momentary relief, but a sense of darkness lingered in the air. I went to the mirror behind the bar, and as I wiped down the last glass, I thought I saw a figure at the back in the corner of the bar, watching me. That night, I researched the story of the missing waitress and discovered something even more disturbing. Her photo was in the newspaper from that time, and beside her was the man who had visited me, but he had also been missing for decades. Since then, I've avoided looking into the mirror at night. Story 2. It was a busy Halloween night, with children darting from house to house, eager for candy. The neighborhood was filled with laughter and children's voices as residents handed out treats from decorated bowls, and some kids pulled harmless pranks if they didn't get what they wanted. At each door they opened, they received more candy and smiles, and the night seemed to glow with excitement. Among the children was a group of 4 friends: Peter, Julia, Caleb, and Luke. They were inseparable and spent every Halloween together, collecting candy and sharing funny stories about their mischief. Each year, they made bets to see who could find the most unusual or rare candies. It was a tradition for them to search for the strangest treats, a way to make their Halloween collection stand out. That night, as they went from house to house, something caught the group's attention. An elderly man, whom no one recognized, was calmly walking down the street, watching the children. He carried an old cloth bag and would occasionally stop to offer candy to anyone passing by. Peter, always curious and the most daring of the group, noticed that the man's candies looked unique, vibrant in color, and had unusual shapes, different from anything they'd ever seen. "Look, guys, he's got some weird-looking candy," Peter exclaimed, his eyes lighting up with curiosity. "I bet nobody else has these." The friends looked in the man's direction, examining the candy. Julia hesitated, feeling cautious. "Are you sure it's safe? He seems strange," she said with a doubtful expression. But Peter, determined to stand out with the rarest candy of the night, ignored Julia's concerns and approached the man. "Good evening, sir. Are you giving out candy?" Peter asked, trying to sound polite. The man looked at him with an enigmatic smile and held out the bag, showing the candies. Each one seemed even stranger up close. One was a dark blue with silver spots, another was red with a faint golden sheen, and there was a green one with an aroma Peter had never smelled before. It was as if the candies had a life of their own, and Peter felt instantly fascinated. "These candies are very special," the man said in a raspy whisper. "But beware, they're not for just anyone." Peter chuckled, assuming it was merely a Halloween scare for the kids. He grabbed a green candy, thanked the man, and rejoined the group, proudly showing off his prize. Julia looked at the candy with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, while Caleb and Luke also grabbed some of the man's candy without giving his words a second thought. "You're lucky," the man said, observing the group. "Not everyone gets these candies." The group continued their journey, but soon noticed something strange. After eating the candy, each of them began to feel peculiar. At first, it was a mild dizziness, something they brushed off as fatigue from the night. But then, Peter began hearing voices, a faint, persistent whisper, as if someone were calling his name. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, stopping abruptly. His friends shook their heads, but soon, each started experiencing something unusual. Julia felt a creeping sense of unease, as if she were being watched, while Caleb had a mild headache that gradually worsened. As time went on, the sensations intensified. Each of them began to see and hear things that weren't there. Julia saw a shadow pass by her side, but when she turned, nothing was there. Caleb felt a chill down his spine, as if an invisible hand was touching him, and Luke saw unfamiliar faces reflected in the windows of the houses. They began looking at each other with confusion, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could it have been the candy? Julia asked, her eyes wide with fear. This all started after we ate them. Peter, trying to stay calm, laughed nervously. It's just in our heads. It's Halloween. We're just scaring ourselves. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. As the night wore on, the visions and sensations became more intense. They started hearing footsteps following them and whispers coming from all directions, as if they were being watched by an invisible crowd. Peter decided it would be best to head home, but they realized that no matter which way they went, they always ended up back at the same old man, standing at different corners with that same mysterious smile. Gradually, they each felt a heaviness in their bodies, an inexplicable exhaustion. It was as if the candy they'd eaten was draining their energy, leaving them weaker with each passing moment. Peter, who had been leading the group bravely, now walked slower, his legs heavy and his breathing shallow. As they passed an almost empty park, they saw the old man standing there again, watching them silently. Julia, overcome by fear and anger, walked up to him and shouted, "What did you do to us? What's in these candies?" The man just smiled with a calm, penetrating gaze. "I didn't do anything, young ones. You chose to accept. Curiosity has a price." Desperate, Caleb tried to remove the candy from his pocket, but he noticed it seemed to stick to his hand, as if it were fused with his skin. Each time he tried to pull it away, he felt a sharp pain, as though he were tearing part of himself away. The group was terrified, and each began to question why they had accepted the strange man's candy. Peter, who had initially urged them to take the candies, now felt guilty, fearing his ambition to be the best that night had put his friends in danger. They tried to run away in desperation, but the man always appeared at each corner, watching them. Finally, he approached the group and calmly said, "You wanted something unique, something special. Now you have something that no one else will ever have, a bond that can never be broken." Peter tried to argue, pleading for help, but the man simply turned his back, leaving them in the deserted park. When he finally disappeared from view, they felt a momentary relief. However, the strange sensations didn't stop, and each realized that the visions and whispers hadn't ended. That night, each one went home feeling forever changed. The visions and whispers continued, growing more intense. The shadows they had seen in the streets began to appear inside their homes, and the whispers that had once been faint were now loud, echoing in their minds. Unable to cope, the group isolated themselves in the following days, each dealing with their own terror alone. And every Halloween, the hauntings grew stronger, the whispers louder, and the man's presence seemed to follow each of them, wherever they went. Peter, Julia, Caleb, and Luke were never the same. Whenever anyone asked what they'd gained that Halloween, they would exchange silent glances, unable to share the truth. They knew that with each candy a curse had been planted, an invisible mark linking them to the man and that night forever. Story 3. It was a Halloween night like any other in a quiet neighborhood, where the kids ran through the streets, dressed in creative costumes and carrying bags that filled up with candy and treats. But among them was a group of 4 teenagers, Michael, Amanda, Jack, and Sarah, who were on a mission. They wanted to collect more candy than anyone else in the neighborhood, and, as the night grew late, their determination only intensified. As they wandered the streets, Michael, the group's self-proclaimed leader, suggested they go to one final house to finish off their night. It was the last house on the street, an old, isolated home known around the neighborhood for being haunted. There were rumors that the owners of that house handed out the best candy, expensive, exotic treats that would make their Halloween haul legendary. "Come on, guys. This is our chance to score the best candy of the night," Michael urged, full of enthusiasm as he tried to convince the others to follow him. Amanda, the cautious one in the group, hesitated. She had heard plenty of stories about the house, about people who had gone there and were never seen again. Still, her friend's excitement and her own curiosity won her over. "But what if it's dangerous? Everyone says that place is haunted," she said, trying to express some caution. Beside her, Jack and Sarah exchanged a glance. Though they were nervous, the temptation of exclusive candy was hard to resist. "Just one more stop, Amanda. Then we'll head home," Jack reassured her, attempting to calm her nerves. So, with that, they decided to venture to the final house on the street, an old building with a shadowy, eerie garden full of twisted trees that seemed to come to life under the pale light of the moon. The walk to the house was marked by an uncomfortable silence. As they drew closer, the sound of laughter and other children's voices faded, and the street grew deserted and dark. A chilly breeze rustled the dry leaves on the ground, creating a whispering sound, while the house loomed ahead of them, its silhouette dark against the night sky. When they finally reached the door, they hesitated. Up close, the house was even scarier. Broken windows, peeling paint, and an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow up all the surrounding light. But Michael, determined not to back down, knocked on the door. The sound echoed, followed by an eerie silence. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, thin and pale, who stared at them with a blank, unblinking gaze. She wore an old, faded dress, and her voice was low and hoarse as she asked, "Trick or treat?" She smiled faintly as if she had been waiting for them. "Treats, of course," Michael replied, trying to sound confident. The woman took a step back, gesturing for them to come inside. The four friends exchanged hesitant glances, but Michael urged them on. "Come on, guys, we'll grab the candy and leave. It'll be quick," he said, nudging Amanda forward. So they stepped inside, and the door closed silently behind them. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and dark. The walls were lined with old portraits, and the air had a strange scent, a mix of dust and something sweet, almost like burnt caramel. The woman led them down a narrow hallway into a room where a large bowl of candy sat in the center of a wooden table. "Here are the treats," she said, with that same mysterious smile. "But you must make a choice. Only one candy for each of you, no more." Michael's eyes locked on the bowl, and he couldn't resist. He was the first to grab a candy, a caramel wrapped in gold paper. Amanda hesitated, but, encouraged by her friends, picked a dark chocolate candy. Jack and Sarah each took a colorful candy, glancing at the woman suspiciously as she continued to watch them with that odd expression. As soon as they picked their candies, the woman's face grew serious, and she lowered her voice as she spoke. "Each candy holds a secret and a debt. You'll only understand it when the time is right." They all laughed nervously, thinking it was just Halloween theater meant to scare them. They thanked her quickly and hurried out of the house, feeling a wave of relief as they stepped back onto the street. But as they walked away, each of them began to feel something strange. Amanda was the first to notice. A sudden dizziness overcame her as she looked at the candy in her hand. It seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. Jack, who had been laughing and joking, suddenly heard a whispering laugh inside his head. He looked around, but no one was there. The sound grew louder, morphing into a voice calling his name. "Jack! Jack!" He started feeling uneasy, glancing around nervously. Meanwhile, Michael, who had felt so sure of himself, was now filled with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. Every step made the caramel candy in his pocket feel heavier. Sarah, on the other hand, felt a piercing cold, as though the temperature around her had suddenly dropped. As they continued walking, they realized that no matter which way they went, they always ended up back in front of the old house, as if they were caught in a loop with no way out. The panic started to set in. They soon realized they would have to confront whatever the candy represented. Michael was the first to unwrap his caramel, hoping to understand what was happening. As he unfolded the wrapper, he saw a small message written inside. "The leader pays with the first fear." Right after he read the message, Michael was struck by visions of his worst nightmares. He saw himself alone, abandoned by his friends, in a dark and freezing place where a faceless figure slowly approached. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. When he snapped back to reality, he was trembling, his friends looking at him in horror. Amanda opened her candy, and her message was just as disturbing. Caution is lost in the moment of decision. Suddenly, her body froze and she couldn't move, as though she were bound by invisible chains. Fear gripped her and she began to cry, realizing that, like Michael, she was facing her deepest fear. Jack and Sarah hesitated but knew they had no choice. When they unwrapped their candies, they found similar messages, forcing them to confront their deepest, darkest fears. Jack, who always hid behind humor, found himself trapped in a place where no one laughed, enveloped by solitude, while Sarah faced the isolation of being completely alone in the world. When each had gone through their experience, they felt a strange sense of relief, as if a part of the weight had lifted. They looked around and realized that they were, finally, outside the old house's garden. They returned to the street, confused and exhausted, feeling as though something within them had changed forever. The next morning, when they met up to talk about what they had gone through, they realized that each of them had carried a personal burden, and that visiting that house had forced them to confront something deep within. The experience had bonded them in an inexplicable way, but also left them with a lasting sense of unease. They never went back to that house, and in the years that followed, they avoided even walking past it on Halloween. They knew they had been forever changed by that experience, and the taste of those candies remained in their memories as a grim reminder that some secrets are best left unexplored.